All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And happy feast day of Saint Scholastica, the sister of Saint Benedict and foundress of the Benedictine Sisters. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight via the miracle of Zoom. My name is Stephen Oakey. I'm an associate professor of theology at St. Leo University. And on behalf of the Department of Philosophy, Theology, and Religion, as well as the University Senate's Catholic Identity Advisory Committee, I'm excited to offer tonight's program on the coming apocalypse of Catholic higher education, presented by Jason King. For our format tonight, Professor King will speak for about half an hour, after which time we will have Q&A. Please keep your microphone muted during the talk. And when we come to Q&A, use the raise your hand feature or send me a message in the chat, and we'll work through questions that way. This event is being recorded, and we hope to have the recording available early next week, because I know some people have asked about that dimension as well. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Jason King. Dr. King is professor of theology at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He earned his BA degree from Berea College in Kentucky and his MA and PhD degrees from the Catholic University of America. In addition to numerous articles and reviews, his publications include the 2017 book, Faith with Benefits, Hookup Culture on Catholic Campuses, and his forthcoming Mr. Rogers' Green Neighborhood, co-authored with Sarah Lindy. In 2020, he was awarded the Thoburn Excellence in Teaching Award at St. Vincent's, an award based on nominations by St. Vincent alumni of the faculty who have had the most significant impacts on their lives. In addition to his excellent scholarship in teaching, he is an active and selfless member of several professional academic societies, a friendly and generous colleague, an avid reader of science fiction, and a connoisseur of donuts. Tonight, he speaks to us on the coming apocalypse of Catholic higher education. So without further ado, Dr. Jason King.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I appreciate this sort of invitation. I've been down to St. Leo's before. It's a wonderful campus, so I'm thankful for this. Wish I could be there, and yet I think this opportunity also provides a chance for a lot of people to show up that couldn't actually sort of make it to campus. So thank you. Thank you for showing up, and thanks for the invitation. All right, the coming apocalypse of Catholic higher education. I think there's an apocalypse coming in higher education, one that bodes ill for many Catholic colleges and universities. It will bring about closings, with some estimating that about 50% of all U.S. colleges and universities in the next decade. I see this apocalypse riding in on four horsemen. The horsemen bring to light forces that are driving closures. The dangers the horsemen pose is less the fearful truth that they bring and more what schools become in response to them. The first horseman, finances. A while ago, a friend of mine told me about a job offer he once received. In his negotiations, he noted that the salary that was being offered was not enough to live on given the costs of living in the area. The person offering the job responded by saying that he would just need to pick up a second job to cover the cost, along with his teaching. The administrator seemed perplexed by the idea that the school's perspective should be anything other than financial austerity. While I think this is callous, such a financial perspective is not irrational. In 2018, Moody downgraded the financial outlook on higher education from stable to negative. It said the slow revenue growth was because of higher education's discount rate to students, increasing cost of operations, and less support from state and federal governments. In 2020, Moody indicated that the outlook worsened because of the pandemic, anticipating an additional 5 to 10% drop in revenue at the beginning of 2021. This is why there's those predictions of 50% reduction in US colleges and universities within 10 years. Within this broader wave of closures, small colleges will close at triple their current rate. That's the anticipated rate. No wonder that the chief financial officer at the University of Notre Dame in late 2019 said that small tuition-dependent colleges will be hit particularly hard. The financial precariousness is so high that EdMit, which is a research place, withheld the names of the walking dead, as they labeled them, those financial institutions who are in immediate threat of closure in their report. They had to withhold the names because 1,000 institutions threatened lawsuits against them, worried that they would be in this list and that being in the list would bring about the reality of their closures. Most Catholic colleges can be found within this bleak financial landscape. There are a few institutions that are better off. Notre Dame has an $11 billion endowment, and Boston College has a $2.5 billion endowment, but most others are struggling. According to the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, the median endowment of Catholic schools is $33.6 million, which is about half of the 65 million that is the median of all US Catholic colleges and universities. This financial situation makes most Catholic schools financially precarious. Of the 350 institutions of higher ed that were identified as invisible in 1976, those that were financially precarious because of low enrollment prospects, 80 have closed. 41% of those were Catholic schools. Catholic school closings are actually nothing new. In the post-Civil War era, the survival rate of Catholic colleges was about 30%. In the 1960s and early 1970s, 50% of Catholic colleges for women closed. From 2016 to 2019, 39 colleges have closed, and 20% of those were Catholic. This negative financial outlook is the first horseman of the apocalypse. It brings the truth that financial pressures are real, especially for Catholic schools, and so demand attention. The danger is that in responding to this perspective, Catholic higher education focuses on money to the neglect of people. This response is already a trend in Catholic higher education. You can see it in the hiring of presidents for their financial background. The example of Simon Newman comes to mind. He was hired as president of a Catholic university without any experience in higher ed or Catholic institutions. His whole career was in finance. He was forced to step down in less than a year because he told his colleagues in a meeting that sometimes you just have to put the Glock to the head of certain vulnerable students. You need to drown those bunnies, because they would count against the school's discount rate if they enrolled and dropped out later on. Needless to say, they removed him relatively quickly after that. The prioritizing of finances to the neglect of people can also be seen in the increasing reliance on adjuncts. Full-time contingent faculty, full-time adjuncts earn 26% less per hour than tenure-track faculty. Part-time adjuncts are even cheaper, earning 64% less per hour. In higher education overall, 70% of faculty are contingent faculty. For Catholic colleges and universities, they're a little bit better. It's about 40% are contingent. These examples, and there's others, show how responses to the financial horsemen can contort higher education. It shows that schools are willing to do what schools are willing to do to secure themselves, focusing more on saving money than teaching and learning, concerned more about balancing a budget than being a college. Second horseman, demographics. In demographics and demand for higher education, Nathan Graw predicted significant closures in many private regional liberal arts colleges with low enrollments, a category that seems to describe the vast majority of Catholic colleges. His argument is based on the precipitous decline in the number of potential college students. When the 2008-2009 financial aid crisis hit, the number of people having children dropped. The earliest of this age group will turn 18 in 2026, and college and universities will enter a long stretch of decline. It begins with a 5% reduction of potential students and ends with a 15% reduction. Elite schools look like they will be fine, as will national universities with a national profile. Both can preserve their enrollments by accepting more students from their applicant pool. Smaller regional schools, especially private liberal arts schools, will fight over the few remaining students. There was some hope that we would return to normal around 2030 when the birth rates rose slightly after the financial crisis eased in the United States. However, the pandemic should keep us from putting too much hope in this rebound. Best estimates suggest a 10% reduction in births in 2020, which means colleges will hit another demographic drop starting in 2038. Again, most of this will hit small regional liberal arts colleges, vast majority of Catholic higher education. Pressed by enrollment concerns, with larger, more elite schools devouring an increasing amount of the enrollment population, Catholic colleges and universities have a few options. They could turn to students who are not usually considered part of the traditional student population, students of color, first-generation students, immigrants. But this requires additional resources from the school, including ensuring a campus culture is welcoming, de-emphasizing standardized tests, increasing financial aid. Catholic colleges and universities could also work at increasing their retention rates with those students who are accepted. This also requires resources, though. Mental health support, for example, is one of these strategies for retaining students. Yet the American Psychological Association noted that over 40% of college students suffer from anxiety and 35% from depression. Almost 25% were on medication to address these issues. And then to speak to and support these students, the rate of counseling appointments increased at colleges 6 times from 2009 to 2014. Because of the financial strain already facing higher ed, it would be difficult to provide these needed student supports. Given the demographic demands, it would be difficult not to recruit these students. The likely result is to admit students without the support, or to put it more accurately, to exploit students, taking their money knowing they probably won't graduate. This response takes the most vulnerable students and makes their situation worse by giving them debt without a degree. It is the distorted response to the reality the demographic horseman brings. The third horseman. States have been decreasing funding for public colleges and universities for about 30 years. This has led to the quasi-privatization of public higher education. It is a shift in thinking. It views higher ed as a private good instead of a public good, and as a private good, best managed through market forces. This market framing means that the value of higher education must exceed its costs. It's a difficult balance to maintain. Schools have tried to increase their value, especially with amenities like good dorms, food, athletic, and a few places tried installing lazy rivers so students could float around campus. Those were not very successful. However, the key value that has been emphasized that people respond to is the ability to get a job after graduation. Such a measure of higher education is partly the result of the cost of tuition, partly the increasing difficulty of moving up the economic ladder, and partly from pundits' persistent diatribes against higher education. Measured by the ability to help people get jobs, higher education still is a value. Over time, the return on investment, although I hate that phrase, for college is 14%, beating average market returns for the last 50 years. It is a return that has grown since 1970 when it was about 9%. Still, this framing reinforces the value is a job mentality. Catholic higher education has an additional value questions of its Catholicism. For prospective students, this identity is often meaningless. In their Catholics on Campus study, Mark Gray and Melissa Sedata, found that Catholic colleges and universities were striving against an overwhelming and broad cultural movement away from religion, a movement that included Catholicism. As Christian Smith noted in his Young Catholic America, emerging adults, quote, do not use their Catholic faith as a key resource for arriving at any countercultural, religious, social, or ethical commitments, end quote. What is perhaps more distressing is that Robert McCarthy and John Wittig in Going, Going, Gone, the dynamics of disaffiliation of young Catholics, discovered that a movement away from Catholicism was less a drift and more a conscious choice based on an accumulation of negative experiences. And the cost game the Catholic identity at best adds nothing and at worst decreases value. Thus, the third horseman rides in, forcing colleges to address the value of their high costs, a truth higher education does need to face. The danger is that in response, schools will tread the well-worn path of reducing their core curriculum, excising majors not directly linked to professions, and advancing vocational programs. It is a path some Catholic colleges and universities have already followed, usually accompanied by cutting theology and philosophy departments. The fourth horseman. In 1990, John Paul II issued Ex Corde Ecclesia, an apostolic constitution for Catholic universities. Its first part emphasized how a Catholic university should, quote, search for a synthesis of knowledge, dialogue between faith and reason, and enable students to acquire an organic vision of reality, end quote. The second part of the document listed several norms for applying this vision. It said the Catholic university should make their Catholic identity known, ensure every official action was in accord with this Catholic identity, recruit administrators and faculty able to promote the Catholic identity, inform all hires about the Catholic identity, require theologians to obtain a mandatum, ensure a majority of the professors were Catholic, and allow the local bishop to watch over these institutions' Catholic identity. The document made clear that Catholic colleges and universities were to work on their Catholic identity. This presented challenges for Catholic colleges and universities in the US. In addition to the fading importance of Catholicism in the life of emerging adults, noted above, Catholicism in the United States suffered from the clergy sex abuse scandal. Since the Boston Globe story broke in 2002, Catholics in the United States have become painfully cognizant of sexual abuse by Catholic priests and covered up by bishops. The 2018 Pennsylvania grand jury report and the 2020 Vatican report on Theodore McCarrick reminds Catholics of these ongoing problems and failures. The overall result is a suspicion of Catholicism, a sense that things were and are being covered up. The suspicion carries over to Catholic higher education, especially when institutions themselves seem compromised. Georgetown University had to come to grips not just with owning slaves, but with selling them to pay their debts. Duquesne University fought against faculty unions, arguing that because of their religious identity, they were exempt, even though A, Catholic social doctrine supports unions, and B, a 2013 professor had died in poverty and with minimal benefits. This difficult truth that Catholic identity is a compromised category in the public sphere is what the fourth horseman brings. The dangerous response is to use categories in the public sphere to define being Catholic. These are usually political categories. For almost a decade and a half, the Cardinal Newman Society's Guide to Choosing Colleges has identified conservative Catholic schools. However, the society has had to rigidly enforce its identity markers, increasing requirements and attacking and then removing schools like Mount St. Mary's and University of Emmitsburg for violations of their conservative standards. It creates a situation where schools monitor themselves. 6 weeks after the president of Ave Maria University publicly criticized conservatives for attacking Pope Francis, the university announced that the president's contract would not be renewed. Other schools have tried to carve out space between liberal and conservative categories, but this proved difficult. Notre Dame was criticized for inviting President Obama to speak at graduation and for attending the nomination ceremony of Amy Coney Barrett, an alumna for the Supreme Court. Cultural categories that define one's Catholicism are dangerous because they shift the focus to public perception. Catholic identity becomes managing a brand and neglects the school's internal operations about their dialogue with faith and reason and how students acquire an organic vision of reality. My focus so far has been on the difficult truth the horsemen of the apocalypse bring and how such truths push higher education into problematic responses. However, a biblical understanding of the apocalypse is not primarily about destruction, but about critiquing a social order to bring about a new, different pattern of thinking, to enable people to see new possibilities. Biblical apocalypse is meant to make room for, quote, a love that continually struggles to become socially and historically real, end quote. That's from a quote from a friend of mine, Chris McMahon. Thus, I speak about the horsemen not to bring about despair, but to push Catholic higher education to see new and better possibilities. While the last horseman, the one on Catholic identity, might not be the most immediate threat, I think it's the most dangerous one. It contorts the very heart of Catholic education. It turns Catholic commitments into branding and marketing. While public perception has to be addressed, Catholic schools will not succeed if that is all it is. The suspicion of Catholicism brought on by the sex abuse scandal will only be confirmed by such superficiality. Catholic colleges and universities' Catholic identity must be the principles governing the school's internal operations so that the public face is the result of the reality. Thus, the way forward is to embrace an authentic Catholic identity. And let me sketch what that might look like. In the Creed, Catholics profess one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And I think we can conceive of Catholic identity for colleges and the universities along similar lines. A Catholic identity should be holy in the sense that it is oriented towards God and set apart because of this orientation. This is not the same as the church's orientation towards God. Instead, I see it similar to the way my father-in-law, who was the provost of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, how's that for an intimidating father-in-law in academia, who understood the commitment of this land-grant institution. He believes its teaching and research were to benefit the state, and so based decisions around this end. Catholic colleges and universities should have an orientation similar to that of my father-in-law, except decisions and policies should serve God and not just the state. What would that look like? This holiness' orientation expresses itself through an apostolic tradition. Catholic colleges and universities are committed to communicating key aspects of what the followers of Jesus have prioritized. These aspects include creation is good. Human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son so that everyone might have eternal life, and we must love one another as God loved us. This holiness and apostolic piece is also complemented by the fact that knowledge is one. It is a belief in the ultimate unity of knowledge, rooted in the belief in one God. This belief does not mean disciplines are told what to do or how to do it. This would be a kind of false unity, an idolatry. Instead, Catholic education is to foster disciplines' understanding of themselves, their relationship to other disciplines, and their unique contribution to universal knowledge. It is a belief that even if we don't see it at the time, knowledge is ultimately complementary. A belief that we must pursue what is true, no matter its source, because truth moves us to God. And finally, part of the orientation to God is an attention to Catholicity. The word means whole or complete, so it implies a Catholic identity that is attentive to who is and is not included, a belief that we are not whole when some are excluded. In the Catholic tradition, this Catholicity is measured by how we treat the least, how we attend to the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized. At Catholic colleges, these people are often students of color, first-generation students, students from lower economic classes. In short, Catholic identity that is needed is authentically ordered to God, holy, by ensuring the educational work is fostering love, apostolic, pursuing truth, one, and serving people, especially the least, Catholic, small c. It is a Catholic identity that is not first concerned with its public perception, but about people, teaching, and learning. Well, I think the threat to Catholic identity is the most dangerous as it touches on the very heart of Catholic higher education. For an authentic Catholic identity to protect the essence of Catholic higher education, it must counter the threats from the other horsemen. The value horseman narrows the focus of college to just getting a job. The problem is not the importance of getting a job, but the idea that a school must sacrifice everything for it. Catholic higher education has a longstanding focus on the importance of getting jobs, especially when it was primarily serving immigrant communities. It comes from the belief that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, and because of this, have dignity. For many of this dignity includes dignified work that helps us earn a living wage and provide for those we love. However, work is also more than this. It is the ability to contribute to the common good and care for creation. Even more than this, we are to recognize that work is not the only measure of worth. Life and people are more than work. Thus, for Catholics, work fits into this broader scope of life. Because of the oneness of Catholic identity, we should attend to jobs as part of the unity of knowledge, but not the whole. It should be connected to living a good life, contributing to the common good, and expressing love. The second horseman contorts colleges by pushing them to recruit students for money, but not providing what they need to graduate. It is exploiting students, especially some of the most vulnerable. And if schools were to embrace an authentic Catholic identity, they would focus on students as people first, look to welcome them, especially those on the margins and those who are vulnerable. It would look at students as a way to fulfill their Catholicity and as a way to enact apostolic love. To do this requires attention to what students need once they enroll. It means more faculty intentionally mentoring students. It means better teaching and pedagogy. Fair, just, and compassionate rules will be needed for residence halls, as well as attention to students whose living conditions are precarious, who are homeless, and who are food insecure. For Catholic schools, campus ministries need to minister to the whole campus, including, but not limited to, the group of students that are already involved with campus ministry. It would provide worship, but also attend to the students' need for food, clothing, shelter, welcoming them when they feel like a stranger, and caring for them when they are ill. Both the corporeal and spiritual works of mercy should be part of their ministry. While such attention to students will help retention and vulnerable students to succeed, it should be the consequences of the school's commitment to wholeness, their Catholicity, and compassion, their apostolicity. Finally, while money is a necessary and essential focus, it cannot be the only focus, especially for Catholic colleges and universities that are committed to being one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. It means attention to salary and benefits and security for faculty and staff. It calls for a degree of transparency, so when difficult financial decisions are made, people trust them to be good and just. In times of financial exigency, it calls for creativity. I once worked at a place with severe financial constraints that were exacerbated by low enrollments. The administration, the president and his administration took a 20% pay cut across the board. They gave staff extra time off, an extra 2 weeks off at Christmas and New Year's. And his attempt was to try to preserve the community while saving the school. In response, the community worked extra hard to try to save the school. Over a decade and a half later, this university still operated. And while it's not great, it is far removed from the threat of closure. It is this kind of decisions that you make from people whose concerns extend beyond financial ones. To finish, let me be blunt. I'm calling for renewed Catholic identity, one that is authentic in its commitment to love, truth, and people. I think it is the best chance for Catholic higher education to effectively respond to the fearful truths that the four horsemen of the higher education apocalypse bring. However, I'm not naive enough to think that this renewal will mean the salvation of every Catholic college and university. There's a wave of closures coming in higher education, and this will include Catholic higher education. And this reality means that Catholic colleges and universities have a choice to make. They can respond to the horsemen by distorting themselves, jettisoning their Catholic identity, focusing just on jobs and job acquisitions, recruiting students and not supporting them, and narrowly focusing on finances. This may or may not keep them open, but either way, they will have sacrificed their souls, their employees, and their students for a few pieces of silver. Or Catholic colleges can choose to be authentically Catholic, to help students find work and a life beyond work, to care for students enrolled at their schools, especially the poor and marginalized, and to make sure money is at the service of truth, love, and people. This may or may not keep them open, but either way, they will find, as we all hope to find, God saying to them at the end, quote, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Come and share the master's joy." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King, for a riveting and engaging talk. We'll turn now to a Q&A. So there's a raise your hand feature, which it looks like a couple of you are already using. So let me figure out who that is. If you have questions, let me know and we'll turn to that. So. Oh, those were claps, not raised hands. Sorry.
I'll take the claps too.
There were several in the chat. So questions for Dr. King? There, Professor Woodard, it looks like you have a question. So if you want to unmute and.
Oh, I was clapping.
Oh, you were clapping. Oh, okay. All right.
Thanks, Woody.
Sorry about that.
All right, no problem. Let me go next to Mary McCoy.
Thank you. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
And I think probably a lot of us at St. Leo feel like we are doing a lot of these things or taking steps in that direction. I don't know if you've studied St. Leo's situation or not, Dr. King, but can you offer some advice specifically for St. Leo?
I visited there a few years ago and had discussions about the place at that time. And you can, at that time, my understanding was you have an on-campus population, you have an online sort of population, and you also sort of military sort of population. So it seems to me a pretty unique kind of Benedictine place that has a kind of versatility and reach that not a lot of other places sort of have. So I think that's good. I guess the struggle that I find, and again, my scope is narrow to the theology department. Like there, you've got the theology department that I'm most familiar with. They're engaged with students and they're attentive to students both online and in person, and that's pretty significant. And that outreach, especially outside of the classroom, is important. And especially in the pandemic, when we switch to online stuff, that outreach actually, while it becomes more difficult, becomes more and more important to precarious students. So that is really the work that faculty sort of need to do. My push, and this is a general push and maybe a little bit for my experience at St. Leo, which again was a few years ago, is an administration that finding ways to support and sustain that and highlighting that. The kind of work that goes into supporting students supporting students outside of the classroom, supporting students inside the classroom is pretty significant. Pivoting between in-person and out of person, trying to develop your pedagogy, that takes a lot of work. And the kind of resources that you need, both technological resources, but also time to develop your pedagogy, time to sort of think about your classes, time to spend with your sort of students, all of that pieces I think are pretty important. And I think that's where I would sort of push places as an administration that sees itself not as the smartest person in the room, right? But somebody that's trying to sort of lead a kind of faculty that really sort of cares for students. A dean of mine who I really like, he had an image of the shepherd. The shepherd sort of stands in the middle of the sheep and just sort of follows the sheep around and keeps them sort of for danger. And that's not perfect in every situation, but there's a lot to that I think sort of helps and sort of supports those. And I think that the challenge is that those benefits are like long-term benefits. You don't get immediate enrollment bumps. You don't get immediate fundraising from the care of students that you have. But 5-10 years out, those are the students that are like, yeah, that really mattered and that really sort of meant something to me. And that's the kind of investment for the future. So my push maybe is for administrators to sort of help that work for faculty, make it function, provide the help that they need to do that kind of work, and also take an investment mentality, although I hate to use some of these financial terms, which is the work that you do now will pay off in 5 and 10 years, and value that work now as well as the immediate stuff that you sort of need to do. So I hope that helps a little bit, but that's based on my limited experience.
Thank you.
All right. Next, I have a question from Father Randall Meissen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a great presentation, Dr. King.
Thank you.
Just a few days ago, I was in one of the sessions for the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, and we had the privilege of hearing some words from Father Frederick Bekina, who's the Undersecretary for the Department of Catholic Education, and he was dialoguing with the president of Georgetown, John DeGioia, both very careful about the words they were using, and both the questions and the responses to, kind of navigate through some thorny, thorny topics. But there was something that Father Bekina said that sort of struck me as interesting about how in the beginning, there was a lot of ruckus over ex corde in the early days. And he was talking about how perhaps over time, what those working in Catholic higher education have come to realize more is that the document wasn't meant to be like a straitjacket, idealizing one particular type of university, and that over time, there's come to be more of a realization that we're dealing with a multiplicity of, when we talk of Catholic higher education, we're dealing with a multiplicity of very different types of institutions, each of which can be actualize their Catholic mission in a unique way. So that said, I'd be interested in your reflection, knowing what would you think? Do you think there's kind of like 4 or 5 main categories? That how would you subdivide what Catholic institutions of higher learning are doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't have room for it in the talk, but it was to thinking about this diversity of ways in which you can sort of be Catholic. I played around with this. So Morey and Pitteret, in their Catholic Higher Education Culture and Crisis book, this is like 2008, they came up with 4 different models of Catholic higher education in the United States. And I do qualify it because Catholic universities in different countries will operate differently and there are different cultural dynamics. But in the United States, Morey and Pitteret had 4. When I did some research on that based on students' perceptions, and in Faith with Benefits, which is the book on Catholic identity and hookup culture, the one chunk of that is different ways of being Catholic identity. And in that, I identified like 3 ways of being Catholic, and I call those like evangelical Catholic identity, communio Catholic identity, and accompaniment Catholic identity. And each of them have different ones. Evangelical sort of Catholic identity tends to be on the formation of the Catholic students that are there. The Catholic students tend to make up the majority of the student population. So they're like 80 to 90% sort of Catholic students there. And so that the main focus of the curriculum and the campus ministry and the extracurricular activities are all the sort of Catholic formation. Then you've got what I would call and that's one side of it. Then the big bulk of the middle of Catholic schools in the US are what I would call communio Catholicism, which is about community. It's about welcoming people. It's about trying to be nice. It's about inclusion. It's about everybody sort of being nice to one another. So it's less sort of explicit Catholic doctrine and more like holding the door open for people and celebrations of things that happen on campus. And it's a very tight-knit community. And then the third one I call accompaniment Catholicism. And the way that I sort of view that is it's kind of a ministry version, a ministry understanding of Catholic identity, where it's not about formation or community, but it's about reaching out to people that need help. And that can be a variety of things and a variety of populations. 2 kinds of schools usually fall into that third group, which is I find interesting. Big urban schools. So like St. John's in New York, DePaul in Chicago, they're big urban places and they reach out to a large diversity of students that need sort of college education or can benefit from it. And then the other group that falls in this kind of accompaniment Catholicism that I say sort of like a service Catholicism are small, rural Catholic colleges founded by women religious orders. And these are usually founded, right, to help those populations in those rural areas. So it's not so much catechizing, but like trying to address poverty, trying to address jobs and work, trying to address problems in the area. And I would think all 3 of those are legitimate ways to be Catholic. And actually what I would push is for us to almost understand Catholic identity more corporate, like Paul's metaphor in 1 Corinthians, where the body has different parts. And so Catholic identity would have different parts where some people are doing this, some people are doing that, but we're all kind of authentic Catholic. And matter of fact, we need all of those pieces to be whole and complete. So yeah, that's a great, there might be more categories than that, but those are the 3 that sort of came out of my research of talking to students. Good.
Next, I have a question from Francis's iPhone. Oh, sorry, you've got to unmute for the question.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Doctor, everyone.
Thank you.
It was a great talk you gave. I graduated from St. Leo back in 1972. I was a philosophy major. That education has served me well throughout my life, and both vocationally and, more importantly, with life's struggles and adventures and triumphs. Any sources that you would recommend reading for further information on this, Doctor?
On
Just on Catholic education, prospect, maybe some quantitative information on where we're at.
Yeah,
we can do our own research.
Yeah. All of the current research that's coming out is like in articles and things. So I'm happy to, I don't know how to best to sort of get those to you other than sort of links and things. And maybe I could send them to Dr. Oki, and he could sort of distribute them out for those individual sources. The statistical pieces that I would start to point to are some of the ones I mentioned in the text. The demographics and higher education. That book is something that I think everybody's been paying attention to and needs to be paid attention to. The demographics and the demand for sort of higher education. This is sort of one of them. I would say it's worth looking at the Morey and Pitterit book, Catholic Higher Education, A Culture in Crisis. I've done my stuff on student perceptions of Catholic identity, so you can sort of look at that. And I would look at Christian Smith's Young Catholic and American. Sorry, I'm blanking on that book. That's here. They did a big study, Young Catholic America, that Christian Smith study on what's happening to sort of the youth. And then the Anselm Academic Going Gone study. Those are the big books that I would sort of recommend immediately. There's been a lot of the stuff is in the Chronicle of Higher Ed that sort of basically sort of gives you overviews of the statistical data sort of coming out. A lot of it's the 2021 stuff is pretty new, and some of it's sort of older. But I'll send those links along to Dr. Oki, and then you can sort of follow up with those as well.
Great, thank you. How's St. Vincent's doing?
Oh, it's doing well. Like it is for Benedictines. We've got a new archabbot. We got a new president. We're doing a new core curriculum, and all in the midst of the pandemic switch. So that's a lot of change for Benedictines. But overall, we seem to be doing pretty well. We've weathered stuff. We had a wonderful. Our Vice President for Academic Affairs had a really good plan for the COVID protocols. So we've been very fortunate to sort of weather that storm. So far, so good. I'm holding my fingers. So
you probably know that St. Leo has its original origins in St. Vincent's College up there. I guess some of the monks went down to North Carolina, and then eventually they found their way down to St. Leo. Well, Florida, where they founded St. Leo.
Yeah, I told a few of my colleagues. I told them I was giving this talk, and the monks were like, "Oh yeah, we founded that," because they're very proud of all the monasteries they founded. Although I did do a history. There's a history of St. Vincent that just came out, and then it's a 2-volume work. It's a 3-volume work, and the second volume just came out. The second volume went back to the origins of our school, and it talked about how we had accreditation problems with like staffing and professional staff, which was this persistent problem we've had really since we've been founding. So it's funny how like we really don't change even after all of those kinds of years. So anyways, yeah.
Thank you, Francis. Next in the queue I had was Robert Kiley.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. King. I appreciate it. Francis, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis, too. I have a connection with Francis. He's my older brother. But I just wanted to say these are actually topics I think that are near and dear to many of us who have kids or we went to Catholic colleges. I have 3 kids, one who went to Villanova, one who went to Seton Hall, and another who's presently a senior at St. Anselm College. I think before the pandemic, there were a number of schools kind of at a crossroads in trouble, but the pandemic is maybe hastening it. And I mean, you kind of made it even more complex, but I see kind of a dichotomy between the schools that maintain a Catholic mission, but yet really preach a secular gospel, if you will. And then other schools that tend to be very orthodox. They're moving more towards pushing church teaching, and that we're not just social justice warriors, but we're social justice warriors based on Christ. And I want to say, as being the model of the school that tries to appeal to the secular society versus a school that gets back to our Catholic roots, which is more sustainable in the end? My second question is, as a big proponent of the liberal arts, I think Catholic schools have a lot to offer, but I also see that the liberal arts in our society is cratering, that a lot of departments, you know, the traditional theology, philosophy, are really hurting. And where do you see us going from here? Thank you.
Oh, those are two good questions. Which one's more sustainable? I would actually go back to my answer. I think we're more sustainable together. And that's part of the answer. I'll try to be more concrete for this. So we're at St. Vincent's here in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. 6 miles away is Seton Hill University, not Seton Hall, Seton Hill. And they used to be brother-sister school. We were all boys, they were all girls. They went co-ed and we went co-ed, and now we're sort of competing against each other. But we sort of do two different things in our missions. We tend to be like community, like you come here, we're going to take care of you. It's going to be, everyone's going to we're going to work to make sure everybody sort of gets along and sustains it. And so the hope is that like people leave and have this experience of goodness and trust, and really stability would be the Benedictine word for this, that sort of sustains them. And that carries them out a long sort of future. So there's still people that come back to the school, like from the 60s and 70s. Some of the professors are from the 80s and 90s. Students still come back and they get married here. And so it has this long kinds of history of really welcoming sort of people. And so I think that sort of sustains it because they definitely care about the students that are sort of there. Seton Hill, 7 miles away, has a very different mission. They are meant to, because of Elizabeth Ann Seton and the function of sort of their mission, their school, and their order, they really are work to sort of bring in and care for more at-risk students. That's a more precarious model, but in some ways it does amazing sort of work. And so they tend to be a little bit more diverse, a little bit sort of more stretched, a little bit more a little bit challenge in trying to figure out how do you reach such a diverse kind of student population. So I think they will survive and sustain, but they're going to look a very different kind of Catholicism, that their Catholicism animates everything they do, but it really is a kind of service sort of industry. Their job is to try to sort of lift people up. And so they will also have a kind of sustainability, I think, sort of long-term, but it'll look very different. And so that's why I say together, and then if you were to add another school that's sort of the more sort of evangelical mold together, I think you're going to be touching on different kinds of populations that will all speak to an authentic sort of Catholicism. And that's what I think is sort of sustainable. If you're living this stuff out, that's the piece that's going to sort of matter. If it really is animated by your love of Jesus, right? It's animated by truth, love, and care for people. That's going to pay off, whether it's the accompaniment model, the community model, or the evangelical model. So that's my pitch for a kind of collaborative Catholic higher education.
And what about the issue of liberal arts?
Oh yeah, and liberal arts. Thank you. Yeah. I did that instrumentalizing of colleges for jobs, I think, is really sort of threatening. And I think it's also short-sighted because jobs change very quickly and you got to have a kind of adaptability for it. But I also hate pitching the liberal arts as just it's useful. It is. But there's something more than that. The liberal arts is really like the education of the free person. That's its meaning, right? These are the arts that make a human person free. Without those, you're just more in our 21st century, more at the whim of economic forces, political forces, social media forces, you name it, because you didn't quite understand what's going on. And so I think we've got to be a real pitch for the liberal arts is that this is really matters if you want to know things that are true and good and right and beautiful. And the more that you cut that down, the more that you're basically training people to be cogs in a wheel. And I think that there has to be a push on it. We're not doing a very good job pushing on that. And I don't really know how to do that. And I've been thinking about it pretty hard about how you might effectively communicate that, because the impulse to just be so focused on job means you cut. And then what you have is just somebody that might hold a job or might be able to get a job, but not be able to keep it and not be able to be a citizen and not be able to be a citizen of this world or a citizen of the kingdom of God. Like that's the real sort of loss and exchange I think that you would have. I just remember when I was in college, like the big thing was like, oh, you should really learn Fortran and COBOL, which you should have at that time, but that's totally obsolete now. So you would really have to learn not just a programming language, but how computers work and operate, how they fit into the business model, how that business model fits into the larger sort of terrain. And that's what the liberal arts sort of provides. And so I think there has to be a kind of a better articulation of the contribution of the liberal arts to the human person. And
learn them in Plato and
I
Aristotle.
feel like Catholic schools could do that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say learn that and also learn Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah. I think that would be part of that sort of the things that free the mind, right? Are not always the things that are the most recent. They're the things that over time sort of keep on opening people's up to new things. And I think Catholic schools are pretty well suited to do that in a way that a lot of schools aren't. So.
I next saw a hand up from, it says internal medicine residency program. So, but they had a hand up. So if they're still there, maybe not.
Evening, Dr. King. My name is Michael Barkowski. Actually, I apologize. I'm under my work Zoom account this evening, moonlighting, so I apologize for the confusion. Thanks for the time, Dr. King. Got to appreciate listening in. I was curious if you could comment on, and you already have referenced it a little bit, just the range of charisms across the church, the different monastic orders, the different, if you're talking Benedictine, our own experiences, obviously when it comes to being Nation Way and Jesuits, there's such a rich variety. And it sounds like you mentioned that, but could you just delve a little bit into how do we learn from each other in regards to meeting this sounds like common goal? And then how does that also bridge other institutions that might not have their own order or their own religious community that either was the founder or a driving component to that? So I appreciate any thoughts.
Good. Mike Barkowski was a theology major of mine that's now a doctor. So there's a pitch for the liberal arts right there. Yeah, I think that's another good way to think about it. The Catholic Church has always had different charisms that provide, that are authentically Catholic, but provide different emphasis. And I think those can carry over into the colleges. I talked about community at St. Vincent's, and that makes sense because it's a Benedictine place. Seton Hill has sort of Elizabeth Ann Seton's charism, sort of serving others. Ignatius, right, has that kind of missionary zeal out into the culture, moving sort of outwards. And I think you see that represented in a lot of the Jesuit schools that are pretty sort of amazing. So I think that's a way to sort of tap into that the Catholicity of the church, which is we're not all the same thing, and we're not all the same parts of the body, but we actually all need other parts of those. So like my wife worked at a Jesuit high school, and just seeing how they were sort of man for others. It was an all boys school, so man for others, and how they were training in their curriculum and in their service, how that whatever abilities and talents you had were supposed to be at the service of others sort of in society. And that was sort of inculcated in them in a way that was felt very different than when you get to St. Vincent's. It's just a different way of sort of a different feel to the charism that's there. And St. Vincent's has a kind of a tension because it's Benedictine, which is sort of stable, providing a kind of a stable place for people to come and have sort of retreats. But it's also St. Vincent de Paul, which is going out to serve the poor in the area. So we sort of try to do both of those things at the same time. I just say, yeah, that's a nice way to start to think about the diversity of Catholic identities along the same lines as the diversity of religious orders you have within sort of the Catholic Church.
Thank you. Next up, I have Nancy Rourke.
Hi, Nancy.
There we go. Hi, guys. Thanks,
Nancy.
Doctors King and Oki, for pulling this together.
Thanks,
It's been
Dr.
really great to
Rohr,
listen to.
showing up.
Yeah, sure. I'm really excited to hear this. I teach at a Jesuit college, similarly to what was just being discussed, and the conversations are similar, although not quite as thought through and organized like what we just heard. So I guess I'd like to hear, Dr. King, your thoughts about the following. In the previous question and towards the end of your paper, you raised the specter of a college trying to succeed and staying afloat at the cost of its own soul in some kind of a way, which is something I've been thinking about a lot. So I am wondering if you have any thoughts about what the markers might be of a school that has gone to the point of doing more harm than good with regard to serving the world, or, preparing students to be good citizens and all of that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's a great question, and a little bit of a haunting one, too. Part of that's the path that does seem to keep being employed, which is the laser focus on just immediately getting jobs. The result then of cutting liberal arts curriculum, and in particular theology and philosophy programs at the Catholic sort of schools. And then a kind of like raising up of programs that are deemed the kinds that get you jobs. And again, I think what it is the shift happens when it's very sort of short-term sort of looking. I want to cut now, and I want to save a nickel now, and I don't see the payoff right now for theology or philosophy. I see the job at, when you're graduating. And that seems to be when you're pulling back from that long-term vision that you're starting to run into problems. And that's why it seems so reasonable to cut a lot of these programs that they don't see as immediately sort of employable. And it's just an example of this. We were talking to our Career Center most recently, and they were saying they were pushing for more art classes and music classes in the curriculum. And their argument was that like we get people into, that apply to medical school or apply to professional programs, and the ones that actually have a kind of a second interest or this broader capacity, like they actually get more interest in the interviews. They have conversations that show them that people become more interested in, and it shows a kind of breadth of knowledge and creativity that people seem to sort of have more interest in. And so the woman that runs the Career Center saw that not just as sort of like intrinsically good in the curriculum, but also has these long-term sort of benefits to it. And when you start to cut those programs, then you start to run into problems where it's just a kind of narrowly technically formed person, but not someone that can sort of think in 5, 10, sort of 15 years. And so I think that's part of the haunting piece of that, is that you get, what you don't want as graduates at like 40 to 50 to like wondering what life's about. And that's really what you want. And this is what happens to a lot of our alumni at like 40 and 50. They're like, wow, that liberal arts was pretty cool. I'm glad I read those things. And it's not like, and you can understand why it's not like in your 20s when you're trying to get your feet on the ground in the job, but like as they get into that career, and then those things start to sort of pay off. So maybe that's my shorthand. Other than that, like the stereotypical path, like cut the humanities, cut theology, philosophy, cut things that don't serve a job, cut. But it really is a kind of deeper of like short-term benefits and not looking at the long-term picture.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Thanks.
Thank you.
We're coming close to the end, but I did have 2 questions in the chat. So one from James Schellenberger is one of my students. Wants to ask, do you think that in an authentic Catholic education, the admission process for, quote, high-level students and student athletes must be changed? And I know you were a student athlete yourself, so. I
know, I got such a, and like 60% of the students here are athletes, and I played soccer. I was a pole vaulter. So I'm a sort of a huge fan of sort of sports. I worry, I think like sports, especially at the D3 level, like there's some real benefits to that about sort of leadership and community, and especially if it's done well. I think it can provide stability for lots of students. Athletes tend to do better in season than out of season. I think that you would need student athletes, but you would also need student musicians and student concerts, and you would also need students that do well on SATs and students that didn't take the SATs. And so I would sort of push for a kind of diversity of things. I think you can have schools that specialize in one or two of those sort of fields, as long as they don't see themselves as they see themselves as part of the whole, I guess I would say. If you want to sort of push to sort of at the upper end of those sort of your elite students and focus on them, that's fine. But you also should have schools that are focusing on your students that don't have a lot of those advantages coming in, or a lot of those sort of preparations. I do get worried when sports starts to wag the dog, when it's just so significant that you can't do anything because the sports controls everything. So, and that's not even all D1 programs, but like when you get up like to billions of millions of dollars, you're just hamstrung and you can't do anything else. So I do worry about how you maintain your Catholic identity if you're, well, let me rephrase that. I do worry that admissions is one of these key ways in which you sort of preserve or compromise your sort of Catholic identity. And it has to be, I mean, we need students, which is always true, but if you bring them in a ways that exploit them and take advantage of them, and I listed ways where we're not supporting students, but I think you could also do that in ways where you're trying to sort of recruit the best, or recruiting certain athletes that are also exploitive, where you bring students in, they play for 4 years, but you put such a pressure on them that they can't finish their degree and don't have the preparation sort of afterwards. Or you bring in your sort of elite students to like bump up your SAT scores, or try to make yourself more elite, or you try to exclude more people from your institution to bump up your rankings, so you can become more exclusive. Like, I think there's problems in those areas. So I think that your student has a good question there about the admissions is one of those key pieces. It's not the only piece, but boy, it's an important piece about who's included and who isn't. And the ease with which you can start to exploit people, I think is especially in the midst of a threat, is a real threat, a real danger.
Thank you. And the last one, this is from in the chat. So Christine Woods asks, she says, I went to Catholic University in DC for my master's, even though I'm not Catholic, but valued the overall Christian culture. And now that she's faculty at St. Leo, once again, it's the overall Christian culture. Just feels more comfortable and thinks that like some universities are even overtly anti-religious. And so she's wondering, is there a chance that people might feel like her will seek out, specifically Catholic or at least Christian schools because of that experience of anti-religiosity or something like that? I think if I understood the question right. So.
Yeah, this is at its best, and Catholic higher ed is not always at its best, but it's at best, right? Like, it can entertain questions that are very hard to have other places. You can talk about justice, and you can talk about truth, and you can talk about goodness. You can talk about what's right and what's sort of wrong. And I think there's a persistent human hunger for those questions. We want to know the answers to those, and we will seek out places where we can find those. I've read I'll give like 2 examples for this, which is one, I went to a public school, or a quasi-public school sort of growing up, and it was very good and very wonderful. And I remember getting to college and having a class in the Old Testament, and the professor was starting to talk about God, and I was like, I don't think we can talk about that. And it took me a while to like adjust my mentality that like, oh, we can actually have intellectual discussions about this topic, and it's not proselytizing, and it's not sort of conversion, but it's a real genuine engagement with the questions that I hadn't even realized were sort of cut off. And that was like this kind of freeing moment for me. So I think that's pretty much this. The other one is that I read a lot of social science stuff, which is, I think, is just some of the most amazing research that's out there, very hard to sort of do. And when I do it on hookup culture, you also see them straining under the constraints of the discipline. Like, they're worried about they're worried about a bunch of things about hookup culture. One of which is like it tends to privilege sort of men over women. That's one of the things that's sort of out there. And so there's some of these concerns that are there, but when you articulate it, you can only really approach it from like health concerns, from like, or, you know, things that would be acceptable in the social sciences you can sort of study. And so you would have to actually step out of the field sometimes to talk about questions of right and wrong, good and bad. And at its best, you can sort of do those things in Catholic higher education. And I think this is, if I'm pushing for that authentic Catholic education, I think those are the places, that's what the kind of places I want to advocate for, places where you can really, students are free to ask, is that right? Is that wrong? Is this true? Is this not true? Is this good? Is this bad? That's the kind of places that I want to sort of push for and have real conversations about them. And I think if we do that, that's ministering to students, and that will pay off down the road, society, but really more important than that, society, the society of God. So thanks, yeah, thank you.
And then just to wrap up, a question from me in light of your talk. What is it that gives you hope in the next 10, 15, 20 years of Catholic higher education?
It's like people show up to talks like this, that on a Wednesday night. It's really students and my peers. I look around and I see them wearing like 45 different hats at an institution. I trying to work, trying to teach, trying to care for students, trying to run clubs, trying to do everything and everything. And then I look at the students sometimes also carrying like 10, 20 sort of different hats, and trying to sort of live this out and trying to do what's good and trying to sort of do what's right. And I think those are like the seeds that I see like you're trying to sort of nourish, and so that they hope they sprout up in sort of a harvest. And so, yeah, I mean, Mike Barkowski, my former student, is on here, and I keep getting messages and stuff from my former students all the time. And I just see what they're sort of doing. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is sort of working amidst all of the bumps and bruises and inefficiencies and clunkiness. Yeah, I think that there's still some good stuff that's being done. And if I can, if I can be theological, right? It's, God's grace tends to work in our midst, even when we sort of don't see it. And so I see that sort of cropping up in all the people that are sort of around. So I would say those are the things that really do sort of give me hope. And so I could write this in some ways tongue in cheek, because you can talk about the apocalypse that everybody assumes is like doom and destruction. And I never really want to end on that. I want to end on the hopefulness and the peace. And so I do have hope. And that's why I can sort of talk about the bad things, because I think that there is hope. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. King, for a great talk, great Q&A period, and for your gift to us tonight. So.